Dr. George DeLeon, psychologist, author, and leading authority on therapeutic community model, has spent decades redefining addiction recovery. In conversation with Lindsay Haig, we explore the roots of therapeutic communities, their transformative power, and the path forward for recovery in Alberta. This is more than an interview. It's a rare conversation with one of the field's most influential pioneers. Welcome to the journey of recovery, renewal, and real human change.
Welcome, Dr. George DeLeon.
Yes.
Welcome to Lakeview Recovery Community. Thank you for taking the time to come and join me in this conversation today about therapeutic communities.
Well, listen, thank you for getting me out of the house and getting here and facilitating my travel. And it's terrific. It's great to be here. It's great to be here. As you know, we've been talking, and then this has been a great visit so far for me. I'm very encouraged by it. But I want to hear now what we want to do in our conversation.
Yeah, most definitely. It would be really good today if we can explore the therapeutic community model. So taking us right back from the early days and looking at the history to bringing us up to date now to consider therapeutic communities of the future. So should we start with the history? The
drug addiction, substance abuse problems in the world, but certainly in North America, they've been around for years. And so we didn't have treatments. 1960, we had no successful treatments for opiate abuse. And now we have this terrible epidemic, and we're still essentially inherited that problem even today. We did not have a successful treatment then, except some hospitalizations, but very quickly people would relapse after they got out of the hospital. And so that original generation of substance abusers who continually relapsed found a way to come together themselves and decide, what can they do for themselves when they get out of, let's say, a detox unit in a hospital, knowing that they were so vulnerable to relapse. What can they do for themselves to save themselves and keep themselves going in life? And there were many stories about that, about how such programs started. One of them was a Synanon story who was essentially launched by several people, a key person, and that was a recovered alcohol abuser, and really exemplified finding a place, coming together, living together, and using living together as a way of somehow initially managing their substance abuse, but it quickly turned into broadening how they're going to live their lives. You know what I mean? So now that's important, because when we finally get to the word recovery, that's bigger than simply whether you use drugs or you don't use drugs. Recovery really implies something larger. And so that was already evident in the first therapeutic community called Synanon. It had its own history, but it was the groundwork for laying down a lot of the fundamental elements of what we now understand to be a community approach. And the word therapeutic, which means to heal, so it was a healing community. And incidentally, for our audience and everybody who's interested in this, we have 2,000-year histories of healing communities, and they could be called therapeutic communities, because they were dealing with different kinds of problems in people's lives, but they always addressed these healing communities. They always addressed that subgroup in the population that was basically on the edge of the population, disaffiliated, unable to be adequately treated or accepted into the society. So that's the thing that's common about authentic therapeutic community approach. Its ancient history is that one, which is these are the people that were out on the margin and came to live themselves in communes and so on. So that's early history and late history. Synanon became that particular program in California, a very successful program, and then had a wrong turn, and that's a matter of another conversation in a different history. But the contribution was immense, and what it told us and what it demonstrated is that, people like this, people who have had damaged lives, disordered lives, and essentially did not benefit from traditional mental health or medicine, they can come together and somehow develop something themselves. It wasn't developed in the universities. It wasn't developed in the hospitals. It was developed on the basis of their day-to-day trial and error living of how to live right.
So it was developed by the people and
By
the
the people.
community that
Right.
were coming together to make change and support each other with that
That's
change.
right.
So when did you get involved in
When did I get
TCs?
involved?
Yeah, because that was in New York, wasn't?
The Synanon is California, but but soon after Synanon, we got this tremendous burgeoning of programs like that because it was obvious how needed it was and how contagious it was. People who would leave from one program having had a successful experience in there would begin to found and seed other programs. And that's the way real therapeutic communities get started. They get started by people who've been through therapeutic communities.
Yeah, and we did that here at Lakeview.
That's right.
Graduates starting help create other
Help
therapeutic
to create it.
communities. Yeah.
All of it on the margins of society, a little outside of society. They're doing it largely on their own. They get help from some academic psychologists. I'm a psychologist. They get help from some psychologists, doctors, and divinity people and lawyers and so on. But those people assist that process. The real process is what the participants themselves are doing in that. I got into it in that context. Synanon began in 58 and probably ended in the early 70s, but I got in New York. I'm a New Yorker, and the opiate problem in New York was even bigger and rasher there. But New York was very vigorous about the problem. They got behind it with some public money in terms of seeing they can launch a number of programs, not dissimilar to some of the excitement we're experiencing now here, But back in New York, that's the way it started. Something looked good. Nothing worked for substance abusers, particularly opiate addicts. And now we had here first inklings of these therapeutic communities starting up on their own, requiring very little from traditional society, except some public health support and money, and they would do it all. But some of the key professionals got involved who knew that it would need some assistance in going along and nurturing it along. And a colleague of mine, the late Mitchell Rosenthal, a psychiatrist, we had known each other and worked together on Staten Island in a mental health setting. He had seen Synanon, and when he came back from service in the Navy, he had run a little ward in Oakland that looked like in a hospital. He made it a TC in a hospital. And when he came back to New York asked him to join the government effort, and I said, "Can you help foster more of these programs?" And then he was searching around and quickly located. This story is important because this really illustrates the real origins and the meaning of it. Phoenix House's first group were a number of people who are on the second floor of Morris Bernstein Hospital, detoxing from their heroin. They knew they were getting out into the street again. They had been through lifetime histories of detoxing. They didn't want to go to the street again. They were all afraid. What am I looking at here? I'm a psychologist. So when I looked at this and I saw that, I immediately knew something very important was happening here. And in some ways, it was a very timely way to see it. And that is an early program starting. I didn't see Synanon until another year later when I visited Synanon. But this one, I said, I saw it almost from day one and say, this is what happened here. And I knew from the standpoint of mental health, this was not simply people being treated. What's happening to them is their lives have changed. It was like the word I use, I'm a little bit dramatic, but the word I used was transformation. This was a transformation. Now, whether it'll be a stable one, whether it'll be how long will it last, were reasonable questions to ask. And they're going to be they're questions for Lakeview. And when we come back to this issue, the whole issue of what we mean by recovery has to do with how long are the changes, what changes can you produce and how long can they occur. But for sure, the changes were there. And I knew that. I said, these people would change. Of course, they're not using any drugs and no crime. You don't see any evidence of violence or radical street activity or anything like that. So that transformed me from a conventional psychologist who was doing research. I always had a private practice and so on. But I said, there's no way I can produce outcomes like this. No matter how talented I was, if I was talented at all, or skillful I was, something else was operating that was powerful.
What was that powerfulness then? What was that magic?
Well, they were living in community. So I simply focused on what I observed, which is this community here. They're doing everything together. They've developed on a day-to-day basis the rules and regs of how they live together, which usually means physical safety, psychological safety, and then learning to walk and talk like civil human beings whose identities are not drug abusers or criminals. So they're going to treat each other different. They're going to learn how to do that. That's what I saw. You can see it's every interaction, every time they talk to one another. Are they talking to each other in a way that's better in life? Is that a good way to talk to each other? If they're doing their job, if they have to get up in the morning and they've got things to do, are they really doing it? Are they learning really to help each other see when each person may be kind of out of line or slipping or doing something that looks like the old-time street behavior or looks like the old-time attitudes of addicts and so on. That's part of the way they're kind of rules that they set up for living with one another. And so they immediately understood, or fairly immediately understood, we have to basically be responsible for each other's behavior and attitudes. And the way we do that, if you see something about me that somehow looks out of line, I need to hear it. And if I see something about you, I need to hear it. But then you have to have a kind of regulated way to do that. Otherwise, you'd have chaos, right? So you can have people just doing that. You can see, yes, where people are retraining themselves in how to live right, which was a phrase that I finally discovered could maybe adequately describe this. But they're doing it in a regulated way. That is, there are essentially techniques for doing it. For example, if I see you with a kind of negative attitude, I've been here for 4 months, 5 months as a resident in this program. I know more than you do. I've done a little bit of changing. You have something to learn from me, and so I make a comment to you about how you are keeping your room clean. So it's could be heard as a critical comment. I'm obligated to tell you that. That's part of what the community is. I'm going to tell you that. And you're obligated to listen to it and hear it and not reject it and not fight and not react. Just listen to it. Well, that exchange is a trained exchange. We're training people in a different way to relate to one another. And the important issue is I may not even have to have a long conversation with you. So part of the rule, I'm using an illustration now, so part of this simple rule was I can do that, I can talk to you about that because I'm a more senior resident and so on. You listen respectfully. Usually the word is thank you, sir. Thank you for that. And if there's anything that's upsetting about this or troubling about it, or we have a different setting when we can talk about that. That's how you deal with the whole issue of minimizing chaos. Time and place.
It absolutely fascinates me that even in those really early stages, like you say, 9 months into this model even being born, essentially, that everyone had come together to promote right living.
That's right.
And that they saw this benefit in the feedback mechanisms and the confrontation in a nice way to be able to help people change and promote that behavioural and thought change as well. That absolutely fascinates me.
You asked me, well, what was it about the community? What is it about?
That magic.
Magic. Yeah. It's not to look at it.
People.
It's people. It's not too magical. When you look at it, you see what I see what did happen there. To get that to work, buy into that. Somebody's going to live on a 24-hour basis with those kinds of expectations from the community. This is what we agree on. And when you have senior people who've been here longer, they have more informal authority. They don't have formal authority because they're residents. Nobody has formal authority over each other. But they have informal authority, which means they have a certain residential wisdom. I've been around here for 8 months or 7 months or 6 months. We expect you to say something smart to me and teach me something and point it out, and I have to learn how to hear it. So that's the beginning of the hierarchical issues and how that grew. Is that older residents should be able to walk and talk.
Be those role models.
Role model means walking and talking the expectations of the community. This is an observable truth. There's no magic to it. They are engaged in a very, very sophisticated, complex, social psychological training approach in life. That's what's going on with them. They're teaching it, and they've set up the environment so that it'll work. There'll be minimal negative fallout from that they'll live in civility around this. They'll live in physical safety. They'll live in psychological safety. And here's the punchline on this. Increasingly, that will reassure them they can show more of who they are, which then gets to the classical psychological problems. Maybe the depression, maybe the abuse, maybe the trauma in their lives, maybe the aches and pains in their lives. But now they're in an environment where they're safe enough to say, we can go wherever it's going to go. It's a distinctive social psychological phenomenon, training. They are mutually training and retraining each other in a humanistic way, how to be more and different than who they have been. And what we really mean when we talk about effectiveness, we say, well, do they really get people to change their behavior, change their attitudes, change their emotional regulation problems? Walk and talk like grown-up citizens, the real word that describes what happens to a lot of our people. They begin maturing, as people. Does that really happen? And the answer is, it really does happen. That doesn't mean that it's a perfect approach, and it doesn't mean that everybody stays long enough to get it, to make it happen, right? You can easily see now why, if this is the approach that we're kind of talking about, the magic of this approach, that's not a 3-day, 30-day, 60-day approach. That's you got to be there some period of time if you're going to get the changes you really want to get. It's obvious. I knew as a scientist, as a psychologist, may not last. We got to see. What was the next question? Will it last? And I'll come to that if you're interested in talking about that. But that came down to what we now understand the traditional therapeutic community. That's a community approach, using every person and every activity, living together as a way of learning about yourself and changing yourself. I've provided that as a kind of definition. I may come back to that in some of our other questions.